Do you catch yourself reacting in ways that push others away, but then you feel guilty and confused? Or were you ever called a narcissist and wondered, what does that really mean? If any of this sounds familiar, you're not alone, and that's exactly why I created Office Hours with Dr. Anthony Mazzella. That's me. Office Hours is a low-cost, small group space where you could bring your questions about these thoughts and experiences. Together, we'll work through confusion and help you build healthier relational patterns. Basically, this is a space designed for anyone looking for clarity, insight, and support. If that sounds like you, just click the link in the show notes below to join us for our next meeting. Okay, I hope to see you there. Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In our last episode, we explored what it means to recognize covert narcissistic traits in a parent. We looked at how these dynamics show up at key life transitions, like getting into graduate school, or graduating high school, or even entering a relationship. You and your pleasure, desires, needs can be overshadowed by your parents' distress, subtle criticisms, or emotional manipulation. Instead of being seen and celebrated, your growth becomes a source of guilt, leaving you caught between loyalty to their needs and your own independence. But once you recognize this pattern, a new set of questions inevitably arises. Now what? Do you talk openly with your parent about your needs, your desire to go away to school, spend time with your partner's family, or pursue your own career? Do you gray rock or even consider going no contact? Do you keep trying to fix things so they don't feel hurt or abandoned? And what happens when you stop fixing things? When their sense of victimhood, this is typically what happens, their sense of victimhood intensifies and they complain louder and more, or they become more manipulative. These are the questions we're going to take up today. We'll look at what it actually takes to manage a covertly narcissistic parent without losing yourself in the process. I'll share prototypical examples and walk you through why simply leaving or staying doesn't resolve the deeper issue unless you prepare yourself for mental and emotional separation and loss. Can you imagine that separation and loss may even mean confronting guilt, loosening the role of being the pleaser, the fixer, and addressing the codependent dynamic that keeps you stuck? Can you imagine that? What happens when your own needs feel less important than someone else's? For some, that process leads to going no contact. That's a radical break from their narcissistic parent. More often, particularly with many of the male patients that I see, what I encounter is a more gradual form of no contact. Maybe this is known as gray rocking. In that strategy, they intentionally cut off emotional involvement and make themselves uninteresting to the narcissist. Flat, neutral, and guarded. That's the most important part, guarded. These approaches can bring relief, but I've also found that they often stir guilt, grief, and deep conflict around loyalty and attachment, not just to the parent, but in their current relationships as well. Even when someone cuts off contact or learns to make themselves emotionally unavailable, the underlying patterns don't just disappear. What I've seen over and over is that the relationship with the narcissistic parent lives on inside the person, shaping how they relate to others and even to themselves. In fact, some patients only begin to recognize the narcissism in their parents when they notice those same traits surfacing in their own relationships. Let me share a prototypical example that captures this nicely. How one patient began to see the covert narcissistic dynamics, not first in her parent, but in her own way of relating. Before I jump into that, let me ask you, have you ever noticed patterns from your childhood showing up in your adult relationships? Sometimes a person can first spot covert dynamics not in their parent, but in their own everyday relationships. One patient gave me a striking example of this. She was driving with her husband, stuck in traffic. He was absorbed in his own phone, distracted by work. She noticed herself beginning to huff and puff, complaining about the other drivers and how bad the traffic was. At first, it seemed like she was just simply frustrated with the situation on the road. But when we thought about it later, together, she realized there was something deeper happening. Here's the dynamic hypothesis. While her conscious frustration looked like it was about traffic, the true object of her feeling was about her husband's emotional unavailability in that moment. The traffic became the displaced target, a socially acceptable way to channel her distress. Rather than saying directly, "I feel left out," or "I would like your attention," or "Can we talk for a moment?" she acted out her need through what? Irritation and annoyance. The sighing and complaining were really indirect communications. What was she saying? See me, engage with me, don't forget about me. What made this moment so powerful was that she could trace it back to her childhood. As she reflected, spontaneous memories surfaced of how her mother's emotional needs were always expressed dramatically. She realized she had internalized, she didn't use that word, but that's what we call it in my field, that style of communication, relying on what? Protest, indirect signals, rather than direct expression of a need. By catching herself in the interaction with her husband, she began to see how these covert, I'm quoting, covert dynamics lived on inside of her and how they linked back to her parent. Have you ever caught yourself reacting strongly to something small, only to realize later it's really about something else? That sense of misdirected frustration is exactly what she began to notice in herself. How old patterns from childhood can quietly shape adult responses. What's so striking here is how she seemingly had this small frustration, right? Like sitting in traffic, but how that becomes a signal flare for something much deeper and more complicated. Her reaction isn't just about being stuck in the car. It's a protest against feeling invisible in the relationship, a moment when she may have unconsciously sensed her partner was emotionally elsewhere. And I say unconsciously because this wasn't even in her awareness until we spoke about it. The frustration, then, is not really about the traffic at all, but it's about the painful experience of losing emotional attunement with her partner. From a psychodynamic perspective, this kind of huffing and puffing and complaining, it's a desperate bid to restore her connection with her husband. We could say she was pulling for what? Recognition, trying to get her partner to turn toward her, to notice her, to reestablish what matters most in that moment, which was the connection. When we frame this in the context of someone raised by a covertly narcissistic parent, the picture gets clearer. For the child, external validation becomes a kind of lifeline. And you've heard this amongst people who have narcissistic traits, the need for external supplies. The internal experience of vulnerability, feelings of shame, inadequacy, or being overlooked can be so intolerable that the psyche develops strategies to elicit acknowledgement and attention and admiration. It's almost as if the inner logic says, if others acknowledge my struggles, I feel real and significant. If they don't, I feel like I'm invisible or like I'm worthless. This mirrors the covert narcissistic parent's own pattern, expressing distress indirectly through passive complaining or subtle manipulation to do what? to draw others in without appearing overtly needy or vulnerable. And because I cannot fully trust my own inner sense of competence or worth, again, this is the inner logic, I rely on others to confirm it for me. This recreates the learned dynamic of being pulled into another's emotional orbit, responding to their unspoken needs, and prioritizing their validation and making them feel better over authentic self-expression. Typically what happens to a child who grows up with a covert narcissistic parent. To understand the roots of this covert communication, we have to look back at the child's earliest experiences of seeking care and connection. What happens to a child who turns to a parent with excitement or reaches out for comfort, only to be met with what? Dismissal or defensiveness, and then made to feel guilty as if they've done something wrong. When this patient spoke about turning to her mother for help as a child, whether after school or getting ready in the morning, her mother's responses were often very dismissive or defensive. She would say things like, I'm doing my best to be here for you. You know I have to work extra, right, since your father left. Or she might say something like, why are you attacking me? Calm down. That's when the patient would express a need, by the way. These moments were not just about a mother who was not helpful. They carried the covert narcissistic signature, deflecting responsibility, positioning herself as overwhelmed or wronged, and subtly shifting the child into the caretaker or apologetic role. As she reflected, as my patient reflected, more memories surfaced. She would wake up to find her mother already gone. She was responsible for herself and her younger sister. When things went wrong, she would try to call her mother at work for guidance. No answer. She would panic, feel alone, anxious, forced to figure it out on her own. This is a classic early experience of overwhelming aloneness. The child reaches for the parent in distress and encounters absence. The emotional message is clear. You are on your own. The result? Feelings of abandonment, helplessness, and forced premature self-reliance. Can you recall a moment where you felt utterly alone, forced to manage on your own, and later realized it shaped how you relate to others? Do early, painful experiences with a covert parent really still influence your reactions today? Let's fast forward and take a look at that. Fast forward to adulthood, when she shared the news of being accepted into graduate school. Her mother reacted catastrophically, framing the decision as a threat to their relationship and insisting, we need to talk about how this is going to affect us. I just need to share my feelings. By drawing her daughter into managing her own emotions, the mother's emotions, her mother subtly shifted responsibility and guilt onto the child. In both situations, whether in childhood moments of needing her mother's help or in adult milestones, the pattern is the same. Protest expressed indirectly. Responsibility subtly shifted onto the daughter. And the internalized sense that she is guilty or at fault for her mother's emotional state. But here's the next layer. What she learned in childhood doesn't stay in the past. It shows up in her own covert relational patterns. So let's go back to the traffic moment. The traffic moment illustrates this. She is once again in a state of mounting dysregulation, with someone physically present but emotionally distant, echoing the early experience of her mother being unavailable or dismissive. Even though I get it, her husband was sitting right there. But again, that's the way this stuff from childhood carries forward. Her sighs, complaints, and huffing are indirect, and I quote, indirect protest against being left alone again. They signal overwhelm while simultaneously defending against showing vulnerability, direct vulnerability. In essence, she's enacting the very dynamic she expressed with her mother, passive complaining, indirect attempts to pull another into emotional attunement, and subtle manipulation to be seen, acknowledged, and cared for. Have you ever caught yourself feeling frustrated with someone only to realize it's actually about feeling unseen or unheard? In other words, it's not necessarily about their behavior, which could be part of it. Perhaps this mirrors the dynamics you have experienced with a parent or a loved one.
Let's take a quick break.
Are you tired of feeling like you're walking on eggshells all the time? Do you feel drained, confused, or like nothing you do is ever good enough? Are you stuck in a cycle of elation, then criticism and confusion? If any of this sounds familiar, you're not alone. And that's exactly why I created Office Hours with Dr. Anthony Mazzella. That's me. Office Hours is a low-cost, small group space where you could bring your questions about narcissistic traits and dynamics and the places where you feel stuck. You'll be met with honest, grounded feedback. I'll hold the group with structure, but there's also space for real conversation. This is a space designed for anyone looking for clarity, insight, and support. If that sounds like you, just click the link in the show notes to join us. Okay, I hope to see you there. What happens when the old, internalized voice of her mother shows up again, this time in traffic with her husband, pushing her towards the same subtle manipulation and indirect bids for attention she learned in childhood? As we saw already, it starts with sighs, huffs, and complaints about the traffic. Well, not really about the traffic, but as a subtle way to pull her husband into engaging with her. She can make small, pointed remarks, drop hints about feeling ignored, or she can escalate her agitation just enough to create now a response from him. She may make her husband feel guilty or pressure him to respond to her needs, not out of malice, but because this is a relational script. This is how she manages her anxiety of what? Feeling unseen, overlooked, or emotionally unsupported. In therapy, she began to notice this pattern in herself, right? The pointed remarks, the subtle attempts to pull her husband in to take care of her. Together, we explored how these behaviors were not random frustrations, but rehearsed scripts learned from childhood to manage anxiety, elicit attention, and then to feel seen again. This new self-awareness didn't just positively affect her marriage, which it did, of course. It also opened the door to her relationship with her mother. With support, she could tolerate her mother's disappointment and distress without immediately collapsing into compliance or taking care of her. She began to assert her own needs, signaling in a quiet way that her mother's feelings were her mother's responsibility, not hers. Do you see what I mean by that? In other words, by tolerating her mother's disappointment and distress, she interrupted a deeply ingrained relational pattern between them. Clinically, these moments with her mother signaled a growing capacity for what we call in my field separation and individuation. She asserted her own needs and desires without collapsing into her mother's needs. She began to trust that she could survive her mother's displeasure without catastrophic consequences. By doing so, she enabled a reorganization in her mother's internal world, where the mother was now forced to reckon with her own feelings. So if the daughter doesn't take care of, if you don't take care of somebody else's feelings, it forces them to reckon with their own feelings rather than displace them onto her daughter in this example. Do you ever wonder what would it feel like to assert your own needs without immediately trying to protect someone else's feelings? How can small steps of autonomy and independence change the dynamics in your relationships? This example illustrates the power of stepping back from the habitual fixer, or, and I quote this, guilty role. It shows how mental and emotional separation, holding one's own sense of self while tolerating the parent's discomfort can subtly shift the relational dynamic, even in cases of covert narcissism. With that newly created space, I began to help her begin to imagine what it would feel like to articulate her own needs and desires. Like, for instance, I wondered with her, what would it feel like to talk to your mother about what you want, what you called your, and I quote, perfect world? In other words, attending graduate school, yet still maintaining a relationship with her. We explored how, when she does not use her voice, when she does not assert her own autonomy, she unintentionally leaves a void in the relationship, an opening for her mother to step in and reassert control. Initially, she couldn't even conceive of expressing her own wishes. The habit of collapsing into her mother's emotional needs had been too ingrained. Paradoxically, the possibility of claiming her own desires emerges precisely when she steps out of her own, and I quote, psychic retreat. That's the internal world she created to survive her parents' aggression, manipulation, and emotional control. In fantasy, she can rebel, enact, I quote this, enact revenge, or assert her freedom. But in reality, these impulses must be moderated, expressed carefully, yet still authentically. This moderated assertion of her own needs allows her to practice autonomy, confront the relational dynamic, and test the limits of her mother's reactions without falling back into old patterns of fixing or complying or feeling guilty or shutting down. Have you ever noticed moments when your internal fantasies of rebellion or, and I quote again, revenge pop up, even subtly, in your own relationships? To understand her adult patterns and passive-aggressive gestures, we have to trace that anger back to its roots. These behaviors often point to buried feelings of frustration or injustice. So, when I say, and I quoted, enact revenge, that may have caught you off guard. Maybe it sounded too strong of a reaction, like to enact revenge against a covert parent. But you have to remember, this is someone who grew up with a parent who spoke contemptuously towards her, induced guilt, questioned decisions, and subtly devalued accomplishments. A hallmark of covert narcissism is that they compete with you rather than celebrate you. They undermine your successes, subtly diminish your achievements, or make your victories feel like their own suffering. For instance, when you said you were going out with your new friends, you may have heard something like, "What do you mean you're going out with your friends? What about dinner? We always eat dinner together. Oh, I guess I'll just eat dinner on my own. You know I'm going to be all alone." That, again, I'm quoting, enactment of revenge, the lingering feeling of injustice. These are, of course, another layer of unresolved anger and trauma that must be worked through in therapy. If you truly want to free yourself from the internalized expectations, guilt, and relational dynamics imposed by a covert narcissistic parent. I just said, if you truly want to free yourself, and that brings us back to where we started. Once you recognize these covert narcissistic traits and dynamics, now what? Remember, that was the central question. Do you talk openly with your parent about your needs? Do you gray rock? Do you go no contact? I hope I'm beginning to demonstrate that whether you ultimately choose to leave or stay in a relationship with a covert narcissistic parent, significant challenges will arise if you haven't first done the essential inner work. Many people report that strategies like gray rocking or going no contact can be very helpful, and for some, they provide immediate relief and necessary boundaries. Still, in my experience, physical distance alone is not enough. The deeper work requires separating psychologically, tolerating guilt, and confronting the internalized pull to placate, comply, or manage the parent's emotions, or let's add in now what I just said, enact revenge. That's also working through the anger. I've illustrated through a prototypical example how this process is possible, how cultivating self-awareness, asserting one's own needs, and tolerating the parent's disappointment, all of that can interrupt entrenched relational patterns and create the possibility for healthier, more autonomous, right? That's the key here, a more autonomous connection. By doing the deep, often difficult psychodynamic work, separating psychologically, tolerating guilt, loss, and confronting internalized patterns, an adult child gains the capacity to respond rather than react, to use their words rather than passive gestures, to elicit a response, right? So they're using their words to elicit a response rather than, in the example I gave, subtle cues like huffing, puffing, complaining, etc. So you use your words to engage a loved one, maybe even a parent, without being pulled back into old patterns. There's still so much more to say about this, but we have to stop here for now. If this spoke to you and you're curious to learn more about all issues related to narcissism, please support the show by subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. And even more importantly, take a moment to leave a review. Reviews make the podcast easier for others to find, which helps the show grow. The more the show grows, the more I can invest in creating thoughtful content that supports you in understanding and navigating your experiences with narcissism. Okay, thanks for being here with me. I'm grateful we got to explore this one together. Until next time, take care of yourself. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.